God is an awesome, awesome God. And I'm glad that He is my God, and I know that you are glad that He is your God. We have been working each evening to not only develop and establish an overall argument or case for the Christian worldview, but our efforts have been to systematically develop a process by which we can both explain and create somewhat of a cumulative case on behalf of God, piece by piece. And so our first installment was an explanation of what the notion of apologetics is all about. Our second installment on last week was an opportunity for us to lay a foundation to have an objective conversation, to have a discussion about evidence and things that are true, with the removal of self-defeating or self-referential terms and ideas, so that we can look at what is before us, look at the evidence that's before us, and look at the information that is before us and draw the right conclusions. If one cannot objectively discuss the evidence, then it's very difficult to draw a conclusion on what the best explanation actually is. And so, as we move forward now, our goal will be to look at various arguments, various aspects of our reality, and then make the case for the Christian worldview being a superior worldview. I unabashedly, as well as you all, I'm sure, which is why most of you have Bibles, I unabashedly stand on behalf of the Christian worldview. Say amen if you're with me. Amen. All right, 2 or 3 of y'all aren't. We're going to pray for you. But we want to make the case for the Christian worldview. You remember that we have 2 prongs that we're going to look at. We're not only going to consider the opportunity on seeing the vantage point from the skeptical standpoint or from a non-believer standpoint, but we also want to hold up and lift up the notion of why a robust biblical worldview is important for us moving forward. So on tonight, we'll look at lesson 3 in our series, preparing to answer and making an argument for our existence and the design. And I want to apologize on the front end. We may move a little faster towards the latter part of our time together, but you do have all the information in your notes. So if the gusts by which I am rapidly moving through the material blows past you, hold on to your notes and you'll be able to anchor yourself. One of the first questions that a person should ask in determining their origin and looking at the question of whether or not they can ascertain how they got here, why they got here, is maybe to turn the question on its head and ask, why is there anything at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? And why does anything at all exist? And what is the cause behind the things that are in existence? And perhaps the answer to these questions will leave us to a conclusion that our worldview stands to be the most reasonable explanation for why there is something and rather than nothing. From the Christian standpoint, our vantage point is that we believe, we hold and subscribe to the fact that God is the reason for everything that exists. He is the foundation by which we're able to articulate that there is a universe, there's a cosmos, there is a world and a planet that we live on. Human beings are not the product of chance. We're not glorified ooze. We're not random products that have evolved over numerous amounts of years, but rather that we do hold on to the fact that there is a God who is responsible for everything that is and has created all that we see and all that we know. But before we can move further in looking at that question, one of the things that would have to happen in looking at what we're doing is asking the question, how would the theist answer those questions? How does the theist answer the notion that God is behind it? God is the anchor. He is the foundation from which all of our origin would take place. And the only way you can really answer that question before we look at looking at it from a classical argument standpoint is by considering the kind of God that the theist holds on to, the kind of God that we say that we subscribe to. And in order to see that, I think one of us, we really need to take some time and look at the characteristics of our God. Not just his morality, his moral notions. We'll discuss that a little later on. But characteristically, there are some things you need to know about God. Put these in your notes. They're not listed there, but put them right alongside of the margin. First and foremost, the theist subscribes to the fact that God is transcendent. And by transcendent, we mean that he is a supreme, incomparable being. But not only is God transcendent, God has the attribute of having aseity, meaning that he's self-existent. He is without dependence on anything else. In addition to that, we hold to the fact that God is eternal, meaning that God is, and I love this definition, he is ever present now, encompassing all the characteristics of time in one moment. That's our God. God is immutable, meaning that he's unchangeable in his being. He's omnipotent. All power that he could have, God has it. He has everything that an individual could think about when it comes to power. But not only is he omnipotent, God is omnipresent. He's everywhere present. Time, the present, the past, and the future. God is there. He's omniscient. He not only knows everything, but God knows all actual possible things. He knows it immediately. He knows it from eternity. He knows even any possibility that human choice could make. God knows that. God is sovereign. God is supreme ruler, independent of any power, authority, and anything outside of himself. God is over that. God is infinite and unlimited, meaning that you cannot exhaust the resources of God. God has inexhaustible power, and he controls all space, all reality, everything that is. But then in addition to him being transcendent and having aseity, being eternal, being immutable, being omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, being sovereign and infinite, God is personal. He is person and personal. God has intellect. He has feeling. He has will. He has purpose. God has imagination. And morally speaking, God is holy. He is loving, and he is just. That is the quintessence of the God that we believe is responsible for everything that is. And so moving forward and looking at the question of how everything that came into existence, one must begin by first and foremost, from the Christian standpoint, understanding why you would believe that your God is capable of being responsible for everything that is. So we've made the statement not only in his characteristics, but we also recognize the fact that even from ancient philosophers, Aquinas would argue that our God, having the characteristics that he is, would be characterized as the unmoved mover. We know that our universe, we're going to make the case here in just a minute, that our universe categorically is not the same as our God. So it begs the question, characteristically then, who would be responsible, who could be behind the kind of universe that you and I are arguing, or you and I are taking a look at? So let's take a look now at the biblical worldview alongside of philosophy. And when you and I look at the biblical worldview alongside of philosophy, we have to ask the question, arguing the question of our existence from what we would consider a classical argument. And the classical argument is made of three primary premises. Well, I want to put these up here, and then we'll look at them. You've got them right in front of you. But the argument goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. That's premise number one. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, if you don't mind taking notes, I want you to underline the phrase begins to exist. That distinguishes this particular argument from some of the other nuances of what's called the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. We are arguing, this is premise number 4, the conclusion, we are arguing, therefore, that the cause of the universe, say it with me so I know you're in here with me, is who? God. God. That's going to be our conclusion. We got to make that case that the cause of the universe is God. Now, the only way we can make that final conclusion is by matriculating through these premises in such a way where we understand not only what they mean, but we understand the argumentation behind them. So let's begin with the first one. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Typically, this one is not argued over. When you and I deal with people who question our reality and we deal with people who question our origin, the first premise is generally not the place where you camp out. It's not going to be the place where argumentation takes place. Why? It's not argued distinctly because it's accepted. We know for a fact that something, in order for something to come into existence, there had to be a cause outside of that thing to bring it into existence. Typically and normally, naturally and normally, we all know, we all argue the fact that something cannot come from nothing. I like William Lane Craig's statement here. He makes this statement: if something can come into being from nothing, then it becomes inexplicable why just anything or everything doesn't come into being from nothing. Meaning this: if something just pops into existence without a cause, then you and I would be victims of seeing things pop into existence all the time. You'd be riding down the street and boom, a pink bunny would pop into existence on your, y'all don't like pink bunnies on this side. A pink bunny would just pop into existence in the car. It would be inexplicable why things don't just happen all the time. We know that is not the case. So we can argue without any shadow of a doubt that that's generally unexpected. That is the case, that something cannot come from nothing. So both from common experience and from scientific evidence, we confirm the truth of the premise number one. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. But then look at premise number two. The universe began to exist. Everybody say began with me. Began. One more time. Say it one more time. Began. That's the operative term. That's your operative term. The universe began to exist. The counter push, or the push behind this notion, is that the universe is eternal. The thrust behind the argument that we are here as a result of chance, we are here because we've always been here, we've existed forever, everything that is as it always has been. That notion would argue, it would drive the fact that the fundamental thought behind it is that the universe is eternal. When you and I get ready to unpack this premise, though, it's typically argued from two vantage points. First, it has the notion of being argued philosophically, and then it has the notion of being argued from a scientific standpoint. Very quickly, when you look at premise number two, it's plausible in its own right. But in looking further at the universe that we exist in, we understand some of the character traits of our universe, meaning that scientifically the universe does not prove to be an eternal thing. We know that from science, but we also know it philosophically that it cannot fall into the category of being eternal. I know I can hear right now someone saying, why is this important? Well, the reason why it's important for us is because in order for us to ground the right cause of our existence, we have to maintain that our existence had a beginning. And so we're arguing whether or not that is the case. Philosophically, very quickly, we know that the universe does not, we know that cannot be the case because an actual infinite number of things cannot exist. You cannot pass through an infinite number of elements at one time. I was thinking about this illustration. I thought about, well, how can I illustrate this to make sure that everybody got it? And I thought, well, you know what? Maybe if I got Bill to get about 1 million or so dominoes and we lined them all up in the auditorium and you all came in and saw all these dominoes lined up and I asked you the question, where's the beginning and where's the end? And you tried to pick it out of 1 million that you could find it. But then I thought, no, 1 million is not enough. So maybe I could get Bill to get 2 million dominoes and line them up. And y'all don't see where I'm going with this. 2 million still wouldn't be enough. So maybe we can go over and ask. We can ask to get some more funding and maybe get 3 billion or so dominoes and line them up. Y'all still ain't in here with me. Okay, 7 trillion dominoes or so to try to put. You still get what's after a trillion? I can't count that high. Come on, math people. quadrillion, thank you, and then a bazillion, like jabillion. I'm going to make up a word to just describe an infinite number. Now, here's the reason why I'm bringing that all up. You and I can't even fathom the number of infinite anythings. And so since you can't fathom the concept of infinite anythings, then you have to go and see the conclusion here that the idea that an infinite amount of finite things exists is absolutely illogical. Philosophically, it does not follow that there are an infinite number of finite things. So from a philosophical standpoint, to argue the case that the universe exists and that the universe falls into that category does not follow philosophically. But the better argument, the more robust argument, the argument that people can put their minds and their hearts around is the argument that comes from the scientific reasons. And when you look at these scientific reasons, there are about 5 or 6 pieces of information, 5 or 6 pieces of evidence that really grab a hold of the beauty behind the argument for the universe. And I want to just take some time and go through these. I'm not going to go through them in any particular order, so I'm not going to follow the sequence. But as you hear it, just write it down. Look first and foremost at the idea that the universe is categorized by number 3 here, the first and second laws of thermodynamics. One of the evidences that argues that the universe is not eternal, but that the universe did in fact have a beginning, is the notion of the first and second laws of thermodynamics. Well, you remember law number 1 is the law of conservation or mass energy, which simply says this. In the idea of the first law, energy is neither being created nor destroyed. In other words, matter and energy do not have within themselves the ability to create. This implies that it must have been created. All the energy that is. There won't be any more being produced. What you and I have is all that there will be. That brings you to the second law of thermodynamics. And I know everybody in this room is familiar with the second law of thermodynamics. In fact, if you are more than 1 second old, you are familiar with the second law of thermodynamics. If you are chronologically gifted, that means if you're old, you are familiar with the second law of thermodynamics. What do you mean by the second law of thermodynamics? The second law of thermodynamics simply means this. Everything that exists is in a state of entropy, meaning that it is gradually being degraded. It is gradually being degenerated. In other words, those of you that were in your prime when you were 20 years old and you could jump a building with a single bound and run the speed of a bullet, amen, somebody, and you could do all these marvelous things when you were 20 years old, when you turned 40, all that changed. And for those of you that are 50, say amen. And those of you that are in your 80s, say praise Jesus. You understand the notion of the second law of thermodynamics then. What does that mean? Everything that exists is in a state of entropy. Now watch, if it's in a state of entropy, it is not eternal. If it's moving out of a place where it is no longer held together and it is not eternal, meaning that it is not being changed, then it cannot be eternal. But then in addition to the second law of thermodynamics, another piece of evidence that we have right here in this note or on your slide is number 2, the signature of radiation. Another way you might want to describe this is the radiation afterglow. Let me explain what that means. Technically, these are signatures that were detected by the cosmic background radiation. This afterglow is actually light and heat from what looks like an initial explosion. The light is no longer visible because its waves have been stretched out by the expanding universe to wavelengths slightly shorter than those produced by a microwave oven. The heat can still be detected, and there's no explanation that brings the reason as to why these radiation readings are in existence, except for the fact that at some point in time, there was an explosion that caused these radiation signatures to be detected by scientific exploration in the cosmos all around us. Now watch how this works. You marry that to the next one that we're going to look at here. Number 1, the expansion of the universe. What do you mean by the expansion of the universe? In 1920 or so, Alexander Friedman and George Lemaitre made a discovery that helped us to appreciate a couple of things. They corrected Einstein's initial theory of relativity. Initially, when Einstein did his math to determine whether or not this theory of relativity was what it was, he did a fundamental math error. He divided everything by 0. They went back and corrected it and found out that his math was wrong. This is why this is important. What Einstein did not want to admit to is that the universe is not static, but that it was, in fact, moving. When this was discovered, 9 years later, Edward Hubble, 1929, found out and generated this amazing telescope called the Hubble telescope. And he, along with Milton Humason, discovered that the universe is expanding in an amazing, perfect expansion from one central point. You've got radiation signature that indicates that there was this explosion of sorts that took place. You've got a universe that's expanding, constantly expanding, with galaxies all within it, expanding at just the right amount of time. You've got thermodynamics that indicates that this thing that did begin is also at a place where there is depreciation, degenerating of energy and time from one beginning to now something that is being spread out, losing energy as it spreads out. This is why this becomes phenomenal. When you go and add that final piece of evidence, number 4, the galaxy seed, Kobe, you see there, you don't have this in your notes. I think you've got a wrong word. I apologize for that, but correct it. Amen. Be gracious. Kobe, or right where you have gravity on your notes, the Kobe, otherwise that's an acronym for Cosmic Background Explorer. And the Cosmic Background Explorer was invented in 1989. In 1992, however, the Cosmic Background Explorer was out in the universe making these amazing astronomical discoveries. One of the discoveries that was made is by a man by the name of George Smoot. George Smoot wrote back in excited fury on looking at what Kobe had discovered. He said the following. He said, if you're religious, what Kobe discovered is like looking at God. Now, why did he make that statement? Another astronomer, another astrophysicist named Michael Turner said the significance of what Kobe has discovered, this Cosmic Background Explorer, is like, it can't be overstated. It's like finding the holy grail of cosmology. Well, what did he discover? What did Kobe discover? Kobe's a machine, not a he, sorry. What did Kobe discover? Kobe discovered that there were ripples in what seemed to be an explosion. And these ripples in the explosion were within the galaxies in this unfolding space blanket. The ripples didn't move too fast or too slow, but were moving at just the right rate so that galaxies could come into existence in this expanding universe at the same time. You add that to the final piece of evidence, Einstein's theory of relativity. Go back to the notion of the math that was off and what it leads to. If the universe is not static and eternal, then what's discovered by Kobe and what's argued in the expansion of the universe and what's seen in the signature radiation, if you and I were to work to play that back, you imagine a universe being expanded. Imagine if you could see that in your mind and watch the video being rewound from the universe that's being spread out. It would indicate the following: the collapse back of all of space, the galaxies, the radiation signatures, and everything that is, bringing it right back to an initial point would be, in other words, once there was nothing, or once there was nothing and then there was something, because everything that is came right back to an initial point in which it wouldn't be a pellet of matter. It wouldn't be some kind of ball of energy. It would literally be nothing. Why? Because Einstein's theory is that everything that is, our entire universe and everything that is made up of time, space, and matter. Say it back so I know you got it. It's made up of what? Time, space, and matter. So if that universe that's expanding is brought back to the initial point of beginning, you and I have the beginning of what? Time, space, and matter. Y'all didn't forget that quick, did you? You have the beginning of what? Time, space, and matter. And before that beginning, there was what? Nothing. It's hard to fathom nothing. It's hard to fathom nothing because we are existing in a something. Are y'all tracking with me in this? And so in order for us to put our minds around nothing, you can't even visualize nothing without thinking of something. The nothing in your mind is still something. That blank nothing, that's still something. And that's something you created, which is why it's so important for us to recognize that the universe that we are in is not a matter of something that's eternal and been forever. Rather, the fingerprints behind it, the evidence behind it, the expansion of the universe, the radiation signature, first and second laws of thermodynamics, the galaxy seeds that indicate this perfect a movement by something that perhaps is intelligent and meant for that to happen, and the theory of relativity, the time, space, and matter are all a part of the exact same thing, points us to this. I hope you can see this. If you can imagine what I just tried to illustrate when I was raising my hand, I know some of y'all thought I was praising, but I really was trying to get you to imagine. But if you can imagine this, look, time is going forward and space is expanding. But when you bring it back, you have that little red line that is an initial cosmic singularity. And that initial cosmic singularity is the point where everything began. Sir Fred Hoyle calls this whole thing, he called it the Big Bang Theory. Are y'all in here with me? Now, even though he called it the Big Bang Theory, can I just get you to tap into your divinity and your love for God? And what he did not understand as being a Big Bang Theory, you and I know exactly who did the banging. God. God is behind. You don't have to get upset. I know some of the scientists, well, you don't want to call it a Big Bang Theory. You can call it whatever you want to call it. I know who did the banging. Boom, bam, bust. I don't care. God is the one behind it. Now, why would you say that? Why would you say that? Well, we got to make our counter case. If you can appreciate that with all of this, science argues this one fundamental point. I did all this and I got excited, so let me stop for just a minute. Science does all of this and it makes this case that the universe cannot be eternal. And the reason why we know it cannot be eternal is because of the information we just mentioned. So then we have to ask the question, well, what are some of the counterclaims? What are some of the options that go to the other side of the universe being eternal? Well, here's the first one. A man by the name of Daniel Dennett, one of the leading atheists in our still thinking along the lines, he's in the four horsemen of atheists. He argues that the universe is self-caused. He actually contends that the universe created itself. Well, in order for the universe to have created itself, number one, that's an impossibility. It's ludicrous on just the front side of things. But in order for the universe to have created itself, it would have had to have existed in order to create itself. And we've already looked at the science that the universe was not in existence, but came into existence by another skeptic who argued that it came into existence by a big what? Bang. And whereas you may not know who did the banging, Mr. Dennett, we know exactly who did the banging. So the universe could not come into existence from itself. That's ludicrous and it does not follow. It would have to have existed before it existed. And we know that it did not exist before it exists because it had a beginning point. But then a second one you see here is that the universe is eternal. Again, it collapses. It falls upon itself. The universe cannot be eternal in just going back to the science. The first and second laws of thermodynamics helps us to appreciate that the universe could not be eternal. The cosmic signature, the expanse of space, reverse the expanse of space, and that which is eternal would never have been an expanding thing. It just would have been. That's why Einstein was so nervous about his math leading to the conclusion that everything that is is had a beginning. That's why he was off on the math. And when he was corrected, his theory of relativity brings into this amazing realm of reality that time, space, and matter all had a beginning. And before time and space and matter, there was nothing except for God. But then look at the third one. The universe was caused by chance. Well, again, chance is not an answer to anything. Chance is not a counter argument. Chance is simply a term used in mathematics that indicates we don't have the probability to ascertain when and where or why or how things happen. So they're left to the conclusion that perhaps it just was by chance. And that does not offer the most robust answer for the origin of our universe. Well, what does give the most robust answer? What is the best explanation for our universe? Well, I think y'all know where I'm going with this. Yeah. The most reasonable explanation for our universe and for its existence is that there had to be a being who is timeless, immaterial, and incomprehensibly powerful. The cause of the universe must therefore be a transcendent cause beyond the universe. Can you hear Aquinas now? It had to be the unmoved mover. The universe has always been moving, but whatever is behind the universe could not be qualitatively or characteristically like the universe. It had to be outside of it. It had to be timeless, had to be spaceless, had to be immaterial. It is an unmoved mover. The cause must be itself uncaused, because we've seen that an infinite series of causes is impossible. That was a philosophical argument. It is therefore the uncaused first cause. It must transcend space, time, matter, since it created space, time, matter. You cannot put a star by this point, write it down, highlight it if you got a highlighter, fold the piece of paper up, but you cannot minimize. You cannot understate how important this particular point is. Let me tell you why. Because when it comes to arguing the difference between who God is and the difference between our universe, if you're left to chance, if you are a product of chance, if we're here as a result of chance and not here as a result of a cause, then you would have to go against all of science to make your conclusion true. You also have to go against all of objective truth to make your conclusion true, which means that it's not true. If you remember last week. 2 people remember. Okay, let me move on. It is therefore the uncaused first cause. It must transcend space, time, and matter. I've already given you that. Therefore, it must be immaterial and non-physical. It must be unimaginably powerful. Since it created all matter and energy, it must be a personal being. Only a mind could fit the above description of being a first cause. Now, let me just bring you back. From the biblical standpoint, when you and I look at our worldview and we recognize the fact that we subscribe to a God who is those traits that I already gave you, a God who is transcendent, a God who has aseity, a God who is eternal, who is immutable, a God who's omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, sovereign, infinite, personal. That God seems to be the only logical conclusion as being the explanation behind everything that is. In other words, we are able to say that our God is the reason by which we have what we have. Amen. But then take it a step further. The psalmist says in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. It's one thing for us to scientifically look at the fact and argue, yes, that is absolutely right, that the universe could not sustain the notion of being eternal. Characteristically, it doesn't follow. We recognize that the universe does not fall into the arena of being able to say that it was here and has been here forever. We know that just based on the science alone. But if you just step outside of that and look at that, one of the things that you and I have to then do is say, well, wait a minute, look at the thing that exists. Look at you. Look at something as simple as walking out and looking at a tree. Looking at clouds, looking at mountains, looking at the river systems, looking at our own bodies. We are not just haphazard, random beings. We're not crude entities, but we're made with incredible design. And that not only argues that if you have design, or if you pardon me, it not only argues that we exist, but it argues that whatever has design points back to a what? Designer. Say it like you believe it. Points back to a what? Designer. And that's the notion that you have to look at second. Never allow someone just to dismiss or minimize the fact that we exist. We know that we're here. We've already proven the fact that from the cosmological argument, the only logical conclusion for our existence is a God who transcends time, space, and matter. But when you take a close look at time, space, and matter, and the stuff that makes up our universe is made with incredible design. So then we have to stop and go from effect to cause, or better yet, from design to the designer. And when you go from the design to the designer, this is where we get a chance to look at the teleological argument. A man by the name of William Paley tried to lay out the teleological argument in a simple way, a crude illustration by using a watch. And he said every watch has a watchmaker. The world, however, is much more complex than a watch. Therefore, the world must have a what? World maker. You can really, whenever you're working to unpack this notion with someone who is reasonable, help them to realize that there's no design on the face of this planet, no matter how crude it is, that does not presuppose a designer. Even a hammer, as crude as a piece of metal on the end of a stick, presupposes a designer. If you can appreciate that with something as crude as a hammer, think about the complexity of our world, the universe, and everything that's within it. But in addition to looking at our world, the universe, and everything that is within it, look at the argument fundamentally. Every design has a designer. The universe has highly complex design. Therefore, the universe had to have a designer. Now, even in the argument, you're putting forth that the designer behind our universe fits characteristically the attributes of the theistic God. Only that God who is omniscient, that God who's omnipotent, that God who has aseity, that God who's transcended, that God who is sovereign, that God who is immutable, only that God could be behind the design of this universe. But going a step further, in addition to the world having design, the world doesn't just have design. I mentioned the crude hammer. The world has something called fine-tuning. And in fine-tuning, I'm going to move past this kind of quick, but the concept of fine-tuning basically says this, that God didn't just make something and say, ooh, that's cool. But God made something that was so amazing that the design of it, there was no way for the possibilities of that design to have happened any other way. And in addition to that, there's something behind what God is doing that made it optimal for human life. Let me stop for just a minute. I was on a plane talking to a guy one time. I'm trying to remember his name. Keith. His name was Keith. And while we were talking, Keith said, "Oh, so he did one of those. Oh, so you're a believer, huh? You're a believer." And I was like, yeah, I am. Yeah, I am, Keith. I'm a believer. And so he started pushing a little bit. And he said, "Well, why do you believe?" Now, this is what I knew by nature of him opening up the conversation. I knew that he's familiar with this kind of cumulative approach, where one asks the question, well, how do you explain how we got here? How do you explain that? He was already there. He anticipated it. Oh, I know what you're going to say. Everything that began to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Yeah. I was like, well, yeah. And so I said, so you're familiar with the science behind it? He said, yeah. I said, are you familiar with the galaxy seeds? He says, well, no, I'm not familiar with the galaxy seeds. I said, Well, the galaxy seeds indicate something about our universe that I think you might want to look a little further into. The galaxy seeds indicate some kind of fine-tuning that made the universe and every other galaxy, all the galaxies that exist in our universe, come into existence. And Keith, because you're familiar with the fact that there are a number of galaxies in our universe, not just our universe, not just where planet Earth is, I know you're familiar with the fact that there are numbers, hundreds and hundreds of galaxies Isn't it interesting that out of all of those galaxies, that God was like, yeah, look at all of that, but that's not the one that gets my most attention. The one that gets my attention is the one that's fashioned in such a way where it alone is the one galaxy that's conducive for human life. That's important now, because the pushback from the skeptic is, how arrogant of you to think that the universe centers around you. How arrogant. How do you know? Watch the argument. How do you know that there isn't life on some other planet? Well, remember lesson 2 last week. You remember all those lists of self-refuting arguments? He brought it up to question. He brought up the thing. So I said, well, Keith, if there's other life, where is it? Well, it hasn't been discovered yet. So there's not other life. Well, we don't know. So you don't know. Are y'all seeing this? Well, you can't say that everything that exists is right here in this planet. Well, all I'm saying is that what exists happens to correspond with the reality of the historical document that says that this God said that this is what exists, and the historical document that argues that this God made this planet for these people, and he did it while expanding out a universe that's filled with other galaxies. Now you tell me that God that wrote in this book about this universe and this planet put it right here. Where's your evidence, Keith? Are y'all seeing this? Now that becomes important. Why? Because the notion that you're being arrogant, you and I are not necessarily false because we're arrogant. You can be right and be arrogant. A whole bunch of y'all are arrogant and just as right as you can be. Say amen, arrogant folk. Well, don't say amen. I guess they'll put you out there. But watch the principle. The principle that we get a chance to see is that not only is this world fine-tuned, and not only is it made in such a way where the design is exactly the right amount of constants, so that just one step off to the right or to the left on a razor's edge of balancing hundreds and thousands of things, that just one minute shade to the right or the left would ruin the ability to have life for any kind of human being. And yet God has designed things in such a way where it is optimal for human life. That's why these constants you have in your notes coming up are called anthropic constants. Anthropic principles simply means that all it's pointing to is a fancy term that simply means God fashioned things so precisely that life as we know it could not exist if the earth were even minutely different. Just one shade to the right or to the left. There would not be life as we know it. Which, by the way, they're still discovering it. Kobe's still out there. Telescopes are still out there. People are still out there. Some of y'all are trying to get to Mars. Stop it. I'm just trying to let you know that the world, the only planet that is habitable for human beings is the one that we're on. Yeah. Let me go a step further. Look at some of these constants. I'm skipping all this because I want to get you to the constants. Look at some of these constants. Look at the oxygen level. On Earth, oxygen comprises 21% of our atmosphere. The precise figure is an anthropic constant that makes life on Earth possible. If oxygen were 25%, fires would erupt spontaneously. If it was 15%, human beings would suffocate. Look how precise God is. Just move it one hair to the left and you won't be able to have this beautiful thing called breathing. Take an inhale. Aren't you glad it's 21%? Go a step further. Look at this. The atmospheric layer. The atmospheric layer is simply saying that God did it in such a way where the sun is able to shine through the atmosphere and give just the right amount of rays so that we can have vegetation, so that we can have the things that we need on this earth, but then not so thin that we'd all burn up. God did it just right. I know we here, and I don't know where you are on the political side of things, and I know that there's all kinds of worry and concern and all that kind of stuff. All I'm saying is this, that God did something to make that atmospheric layer like he did it. Right. So we ought to thank God for it. Yeah. Look at this next one. The moon and the earth gravitational interaction. I know we look out at that moon sometimes and we, especially in West Texas, you can see it. It's full, it's beautiful. But what you ought to appreciate is that the interaction between the moon and the earth is so amazing. By the way, there are other planets with many moons, other planets that all have all kinds of stuff. And the interaction with those moons make those planets unstable. You've got collapses that take place. You've got satellites that crash into those planets. You've got all kinds of stuff that's chaotic on these other planets. But this beautiful planet called Earth, however, the dance between the moon and the earth is just so precise that the interaction, if the interaction were greater, it would cause tidal wave effects on the ocean and atmosphere, and the rotation period would be too severe. If it were less, orbital changes would cause climatic instabilities. In either event, life on Earth would be impossible unless the earth and the moon were in harmony like they are. Going a step further, look at the carbon dioxide level. This is another anthropic constant. If the CO2 level were higher than it is now, the runaway greenhouse effect would take place and everything would burn up. If it was lower than it is, plants wouldn't be able to exist. And I love this because the carbon dioxide level presupposes that God made everything that is our exhale and the inhaling of the plants to work in such harmony where everybody gets exactly what they need. You may not know it, but you're helping a tree out every time you breathe. Amen. You're helping grass out. And I know that's not a whole lot of grass in West Texas, but you're helping out the little bit of vegetation that we have in order to have life. What about gravity itself? Gravity itself is awesome. If you imagine gravity not being like it is, I don't even know what that math means. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not going to even try to front and tell you what that means. All I know is this. If the gravity wasn't right, we'd be off this thing. We'd either be crushed or we'd be thrown off the planet altogether. But look, the centrifugal force. I love the centrifugal force because what that suggests is that the way that the earth is spinning, and I love this about God, thank God for gravity. I know especially those of us that are heavy set, praise Jesus. Every now and then gravity works against us when we have to do cardio especially, say amen. And we wish that it was a little bit less on our knees. But if the centrifugal force didn't have the gravity that we had, while this planet is moving at the rate that it's moving around the sun as it's moving, we would all be, can you imagine having a conversation with somebody and the next thing you know, whoop, there they go. So the centrifugal force works for us. And it's an anthropic principle that allows everything that is to be held in such a way where there isn't any disturbance. Look at this next one here. The expansion rate. Again, going back to the science we saw earlier, you can put, if you're taking notes, you can put right next to this one the galaxy seed indication from the first argument and just connect the dots here. If the universe had expanded 1/millionth more slowly than it did, expansion would have stopped and the universe would have collapsed back in on itself and stars would not have formed. If it expanded any further or faster than it did, the galaxies would not come into existence. This is absolutely remarkable. This is what Kobe discovered as Kobe's watching this little bit of a ripple. In your mind, if you can imagine galaxies all over space, it's a little bit of give and take that's taking place, where they are coming into existence. Y'all don't like my dance at all? Coming into existence at just the right pace so that the galaxies would come and everything would be exactly like it is. But put this in your notes. Psalm 33 verse 6 and verse number 9, the Bible says this about your God. He spoke it into existence. Every star that is, everything that is. Our God, which God? That transcendent, omnipotent, omnipresent, aseity God. That God spoke everything that is into existence, and he knew at just the right rate to make it come into existence. Boy, that's awesome. Let me go a step further. There are a couple of other constants. I don't have time to go over this, but when you get a chance, if you get your hands on, let me put a disclaimer by this so that nobody writes a letter to me later on. Hugh Ross. Okay, nobody moved. Good. Hugh Ross has given some really good information on the science behind creation. Now, he is a theistic, old earth guy. However, he does something to describe Jupiter. And you see that asteroid belt just right there. And in his description of the science, this is why I'm bringing it up for you. In his description of the science, he helps us to appreciate that Jupiter and the way that the solar system came in our solar system, in our galaxy, came into existence, that this asteroid belt just on the other side of Jupiter is made in such precision that it's literally stopping random meteorites from flying in and hitting Earth, because the asteroid belt, y'all don't know where to shout. The asteroid belt is stopping random meteorites from flying into planet Earth. They're coming out from the outside of the universe, but they're being held up by the asteroid belt just outside of Jupiter. So you mean to tell me that God didn't align this thing at just the right way, in just the right time, with just the right amount of disturbance to make life on planet Earth optimal for you? How arrogant of you. It's arrogant, but it's true. Look at this next one. I'm going to hurry up. The thickness of the earth. Go back and read that one. Oh, look at this one. This is another one. Put in your notes Psalm 104 or 3, verse 5. 103, 104, verse 5. Oh, my Bible. Oh, right here. Sorry. Hold on. Talk amongst yourselves for 2 seconds. All right, stop. Psalm 104. Yeah, 104. 104, verse 5. He established the earth upon its foundation so that it would not totter forever. Or in other words, so it would not move out of its place. Oh, that's your shout. Watch this. This constant helps us to appreciate that the earth in this 23-degree tilt is fashioned, placed in just the right way, that it doesn't tilt too far to the right or to the left, too far off that axis, moves just the right amount so that it constantly has the right seasonal and the right rotation around the planet itself. Absolutely phenomenal. No one can be attributed to placing that in just the right place except for the God that did it in such a way where he made life conducive for us. Arrogant. But it's true. Even when it comes to the atmospheric discharge, all over the planet, all over the world, you and I deal with lightning strikes, atmospheric discharge, and all over the different parts of the world. But here's the thing that you want to remember about this. What God does in the atmospheric discharge all over the world, all over the planet, is something that's remarkable. Because if it were less, there would be little nitrogen that fixes or that moves through the soil. And if you don't have the nitrogen moving through the soil, you don't have plant life for things to grow. God allows, even for something like that, to be made in such a way where it is of benefit of optimal life. And then even something as chaotic as earthquakes and the constants of earthquake. We look at these things and we think this seismic activity is just too much. But if the seismic activity was lost, then the nutrients on the bottom of the ocean floor would not be brought to the top and moved into the systems where rivers and natural water beds would be fed in such a way where those natural nutrients would come in and supply you and I for what we need. For what? Optimal life. God made all of these anthropic principles in addition to the world he made in such a way where the only reasonable conclusion, when you look at it, is that he had to be the one behind it. Right. Consider the counters, just real quick, and I'm landing. Consider the counters. The counters are, oh, no. Just because you see that there's intelligent design, it doesn't really mean that there's intelligent design. The only reason you have intelligent design is because given the right amount of time, it would have naturally have come into existence anyway. So just give the world the right amount of time and the intelligent design that you see would have eventually come into existence. Is that not one of the most ridiculous things you've ever heard in your life? And yet that's one of the counters. The counter is basically described as the weak anthropic principle. And the weak anthropic principle says that what you see as being an anthropic constant is really not an anthropic constant. It's simply what would have happened through the natural, normal evolutionary process. But it presupposes that evolution is true. And since it presupposes evolution is true, it denies the cosmological argument. Evolution cannot be true because evolution suggests an eternal-like state, and we already know that the world is not eternal. Another counter-argument is that, well, the reason why you have what you have and it's designed the way it has been designed is because of something called the cosmos, or the universe-making machine. And the universe-making machine made a number of universes, and you finally got one produced in which you and I can have the beautiful anthropic horizon that we have now. Oh, really? Well, the problem with the universe-making machine is that you still have to ascertain where that universe-making machine came from. So it doesn't follow. Another argument is, of course, it just happened by chance. But chance is not an argument. And even if you take these three and stack them alongside of the God that we serve, God is the best explanation for the world that we live in. He's the best explanation, not only because of his character, but he's the best explanation for what we will argue because of the Jesus of history, who lived, died, was buried, rose again, and said, everything that I wrote is true. Well, what did you write, Lord, that helps me to know that everything that is existence is in existence? And it's not just me being arrogant. He says in Isaiah 45 and verse 18, put this in your notes, and I'm landing right here. For this is what the Lord says. He who created the heavens, he is God. He who fashioned and made the earth. He founded it. He did not create it to be empty, but formed it to be inhabited. He says, I am the Lord, and there is no other. Amen. And the church said, Amen. Amen. Stand your ground.